Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Galaxy's greatest online convention. I'm Tom Shapira, comics critic with the Comics Journal, Haaretz, and others. And this is the critical panel, the panel in which we talk about Judge Dredd from a critical perspective. With me are some of the best comics critics you can find. Judge Dredd, this is a character that touches on a lot of topical issues, critical issues in a very, very serious manner. With that in mind, I want to ask you, the chin, how big should it be?
As big as possible, right? That's always the goal in Judge Dredd. Anything, go as big as possible, as many guns as possible, as many explosions as possible. The chin has to follow the same rules.
What do you say, Chloe? Are we aiming for size or like sharpness? Should it be like able to poke your eye out?
I don't know. I kind of like. I'm a big fan of the Mick McMahon chin, where it's like just really, just very square, but there's a nice angle to it, and it kind of accomplishes all of those things at once. You don't want to get too close to it, but you merely need to step back and admire.
And Zach, what's your opinion on chinness?
I think the important thing with the chin is that it kind of commands its presence on the page. So however they want to do that, I'm all for it. Big or not as big.
And see, it's kind of a joke thing to get the panel going, but I think there is something to it of, it's one of those first thing you notice of, okay, there's this regular heroic chin that we associate with characters, you know, your Supermans, your Batmans, like you see it and it's like, oh, obviously it's very square, therefore it's a fair character. And you have Judge Dredd, which takes it all the way to the top, which even before the character says or does anything, when you first see it on the page, and it doesn't matter which prog you start with, you kind of get the sense of something is a bit off here. This is not your typical heroic character, which I think was an interesting statement straight from the start by Azquera. So what does Judge Dredd represent to you? When you first hear the name, what's like the first thing you think of? You think of like, oh, it's a big action adventure thing with a lot of explosions and the 2000 AD pacing of every single page, everything has to happen? Or do you think police procedural, or does it take you someplace else? Let's start with Chloe.
I mean, it's really complicated, right? Because it's not something, Dredd as a whole, especially with 45 years of history, is not really something that you can boil down into one particular genre. And I don't know if I had to pinpoint it. Dredd to me is kind of a I'd probably go with it with an adventure strip. I'd also go with the police procedural sitcom, because there's so much broad comedy to be found in Dredd, and there's so much amid all of the seriousness and the really honestly heavy topics that have almost been foretelling in a way. There's also a lot of humor, and there's been a lot of strips that are that tackle things that shouldn't be funny in ways that are incredibly funny. And so I'd say police procedural, but don't discount the fact that it could also be in many ways like a really bizarre sitcom.
There was one of my favorite comics period from last year was, I think it was a Ken Nyman Judge Dredd strip in which he had to team up with a psychic who could see all people naked. That was like her psychic power.
Yes, exactly.
Walks around and she doesn't tell anybody, oh, I can see everything all the time. I have no.
Yes.
Like,
or it's like any of the sensitive Clegg stuff. That has been out in recent years, or even taking it back like way old and doing like the Wagner story, the Auld Lang Syne, which is one of my favorites, because it's any opportunity that Wagner has to be extraordinarily Scottish is worth every moment, because he just completely leans into it. Or the Kenny Who stuff, there's countless times where it's okay to not take Dredd seriously, and I think that's something really important to remember.
And Tiffany, what's your like first thing that comes to mind when you think about Judge Dredd as either as a character or as a comic, as a strip?
Yeah, I think jumping off what Chloe was just saying, it's humorous, and it's, I guess the way I look at it is political commentary, right? But what is kind of just like like I was saying, going bigger, but also going more extreme and like pushing a concept that someone is pushing an idea or a belief that someone might have to its very edge and just saying, we'll see where this logic gets you. And not necessarily always in a slippery slope type of way, but just in a, okay, well, you think this idea doesn't matter, or you think that, oh, well, it's okay if I just believe this. But imagine if there was a whole world that also followed those rules, or imagine if a militarized police force followed these rules as law. What would that look like? And it is very humorous to a point, as well as being kind of, it's pushing the reader in different ways, right? It's never really necessarily, I think sometimes there's a reputation of kind of these punchy comics being like very passive, but there's nothing really passive about Judge Dredd, right? It's always talking about, and this is why it's so interesting to have so much history, but it's always talking about what's going on, right? And that's what makes it interesting to read.
And Zach?
Yeah, not to repeat anything anyone else has said. I'll just try to be as additive as possible because they did such a good job. But I think one of the things that I always tend to think of with Judge Dredd consistently bringing is sort of cautionary tales. Like whatever it's taking on, it like seems to be just not necessarily moralizing, but just imagining the worstest things it can get, and how it's just sowing misery across the board, and doing so in sort of a flexible way. Like it can do so with police militarization, as well as just sort of like Chloe was saying, more absurd subject matter as well. It's always taken as sort of a very cautionary as far as like, this is not where we want to end up.
And you've all mentioned the 45 years, which is why we have this con. And Judge Dredd is one of those incredibly rare comic strip of, it's been running for all this time, basically nonstop. I think there was one prog that didn't have a Judge Dredd story in it, the one with a big slaying taken all over the pages. But 45 years nonstop running, and it's basically still being, not all the way, but mostly written by this one guy. It's guided by John Wagner. It's his vision. Even now, where he's only doing once or twice a year, comes back, and the other time it's your Rob Williams, your Ken Nyman and such. It's still oh, this is the guy leading the pack, and you can almost chronicle, I think, his changing attitude to the world through the strip, from those early years of, what am I even doing? I'm trying to figure out what's successful, to now being so self-assured of, I know what I'm doing here. So what do you think, if you've been reading it for a long time, what do you feel has changed? Where do you think we're going with it? Chloe?
Oh, I would. The beauty of having Wagner, especially still having Wagner around, is you still get glimpses of what he did even way back when. And I think that the core of what he started Dredd with is still very much there. But the nice part, as with any kind of IP, you have these new creators that come on and bring their own spin while still being able to add in the parts of what has made it running so long, which does actually stem from those core beliefs and the saying the quiet part out loud, which is kind of what Wagner intended to do with the character. It was supposed to be this Dirty Harry-esque, terrifying cop character that wasn't afraid to get a little bit more absurd with it, to try and play with the tone. And it's still very much that in so many ways, and every creator has brought something new. And I mean, it's just kind of incredible that has been the case. And even during the years that we don't like to talk about, which is 93 through 2000 something, there's even value just in the way that the character has been able to morph while always no pun intended, stick to his guns.
I think, again, it's interesting because, like you said, 45 years, and it works in real time. So basically what we have here is the main character is 45 years older than he started, and he didn't start as like a kid. And we also see the world growing around him. And just recently we had the America Jara character, taking more of a center stage again. And that's a character that we first met when she was like a baby. Like we literally saw her post-birth on the page, and now she's like an adult person forced to handle her legacy and the world that she was forced into. And Tiffany, I'm interested, what would you say, how do you see it compared to like quote unquote American comic book continuity, like your superhero stuff, where you also have a lot of history, but because of the whole illusion of change idea, they can't really grab it. They can't really say, oh, we've been doing this for decades and decades.
The expectations are different, right? Especially because the comic is more controlled under like 2000 AD versus like something like a Marvel, like a Captain America comic. You're having like, I guess now you also have like the Judge Dredd, the full magazine, but like it is much more of a controlled brand. And it does change though. Like Chloe was just saying, over the years, like Dirty Harry was something that was responding to a cultural moment. And Judge Dredd was also responding to a cultural moment. All of the imagery, all of the world is still kind of responding to the cultural moment where Judge Dredd was born. But through the time within that world that was built, everything's kind of present as well, because you have to be, or else nobody would read it, right? And also that's how you keep things interesting. That's how you have actual political commentary. So it's an interesting situation where like the aesthetic is still very much 45 years old, but a lot of the issues, to varying degrees of success, tend to be wanting to do something new, even though the actual framework is still very much 45 years old. And there's something like, I think people run into the same issues with a character like Captain America, where it's like Captain America was born as and used as wartime propaganda, and there's this huge patriotic aspect of him. And how do you use that in a modern context? How do you deal with that history? And I think some people might feel the same way with, well, the depiction of fascists, right? And like how fascist imagery is used, because the context of that has changed. We've seen that with the Punisher, right? What does the Punisher skull mean now when something has been co-opted? And things that we see in Judge Dredd are often things that we see in like kind of the modern fascist world too, right? So there's always kind of this interesting push and pull between these two structure storytelling that I find really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a problem, and it's a problem that Wagner and other writers and artists have been grappling with since the beginning of. They start with, this is someone that could be played easily as both a hero and a villain, and they have no problem of. I think my favorite example is Letter from a Democrat, one of the most brutal Judge Dredd stories, one of the most brutal comic stories ever, where we just see Dredd going to this pro-democracy activist and just shooting her. And we've been told, oh, that's a mother, her children are watching on television, and he just guns her down. And a week later, you'll have a really stupid, silly comic strip where he's fighting like time-traveling boats with Vikings or something, with like flying Viking ghosts. Yeah. And when you read it in the collection, it's like a really break. What just happened? I just finished like, being appalled by this guy, and now I'm supposed to cheer for him saving Mega City 1 from like flying Dutchmen. I don't remember exactly what it was. And it's a question of how we as modern readers, as critics particularly, can deal with this change of point of view that's inherent to the strip.
I think there's a lot to be said for again, I know this, it's kind of a point that I keep coming back to, but Dredd is such a malleable subject that you can't, Dredd is not as simple as, here's a story about bad guy, good guy, gray area, moral thing, tackling heavy political subjects. It's just not that simple. And as a reader, you have to be able to sit there and go, okay, I know that I can expect one type of story, and I also know that I can expect another type of story. And despite the funny stories, having this character that committed these atrocities in the last story, you have to roll with the punches. And if you try to go into these lighthearted, if you try to go into these air clearing stories that try to take the weight off of it a little bit with the same mindset that you do the heavy hitting, like, holy shit stories, you're going to have a bad time. And honestly, you're not going to get the same level of enjoyment out of it that you would if you can just go, okay, I guess this is time for something new. Because honestly, after 45 years, again, you can only expect a multitude of stories. If it was just one kind of story, you're going to end up with a comic that dies off or is really fucking boring after that long. And I think that if anything else, the ability for Dredd to go from something heavy and awful to something like entirely innocuous and really bizarre just shows off the talent and the breadth of the writers, but also like makes the readers have to try, which is more than I think a lot of comics can say that they do on a regular basis.
And another thing that's interesting to me is, and that's for the whole panel, feel free to answer, is the idea of this is a dystopian story from the aware point of view of we're looking at from above, from the point of view of the wardens, as it were. And usually when you have a dystopia, it's always like, oh, it's the rebels, it's the people fighting, or in the case of 1984, it's the people who are grinded under the heel. And this is the rare, no. This is dystopia. We know this is a dystopia. And here's the people running it. And here's why they do it. Here's the most evil and yet understandable thing is how they keep justifying all the stuff that they do to people in the name of, well, obviously we have to protect the citizens by, not letting them do anything, by shooting them. That's the only way we can save them. And have you encountered this point of view in many other kinds of fiction and other types? And what does it make you feel like looking at through their eyes?
It's interesting, like the kind of dialogue that you were just giving to the judge characters, because it reminds me of a lot of dialogue used like by abusive parents. In real life, but also in stories, right? Where it's like, I'm protecting you, or abusive spouses, or any kind of like abusive relationship. And I feel like that's where we see it the most. We don't necessarily see it. Every once in a while, we'll see like a supervillain in a movie who's like, I'm going to destroy the world to save it. Right, but usually that doesn't hit the same way, right? Because it doesn't feel personal, because the imagery and the world of Judge Dredd is so scary in a lot of ways, partially because it mirrors history and partially because it mirrors our current reality. Like, it feels much more, I think what it does is it humanizes the judges, right? Because we realize that this is a logical, this is a thought pattern that anybody could have if they were put in a certain situation, right? If you're put in training and this is what you were told, you would believe it, because that they've built this narrative in this way. And that is the narrative that we see in a lot of militaries, right? So I think that's the part that makes it the most scary, is we're seeing it's kind of like when you hear about cult stories and you see the way that cult people are bringing people into the cult and like the language they're using, like, oh, you're special and here you're gonna have a family, all these things that people want to hear, right? In the same way, people want to hear that they're going to be secure and safe, and then nothing's going to happen to them as long as they follow the letter of the law, and everyone who's getting punished is a bad person. Those are the things that people want to hear, right? This is what makes people rely on a police force that brutalizes people, right? This is what kind of creates this cognitive dissonance between like what we see in the news and what people do when they call the cops when they see something, right? I think having that perspective adds it's just a very personal level of horror to it, because that could be you, right? If you were put in that situation, that could be you too.
Yeah, like and the constant justification within the strip of, well, obviously all citizens are guilty of something. Like obviously you did something wrong. So if a mistake happened, like if Judge Dredd just shot a guy for no reason, well, there a reason could be found if need be. And it's not even like, oh, we're gonna fabricate something. It's, well, no. Within the framing that we've created, within the framing that we imposed on the world, everything we do is justified because everything we do is necessary. And for, like you said, like an abusive spouse or a parent, it's like, it's for your own good. It's for your own good, and you're gonna take it, and you have no way to oppose. You're not leaving. You're staying here. Boy, this is becoming even more depressing than I could have imagined.
Judge Dredd.
Judge Dredd, it's depressing. We're doing a great work at pushing the strip forward. One of I wanted to talk about some of the more recent stories, because when you talk about something that's like, again, 45 years of history, it's easy to get hung up on the past. One of my favorite recent storylines was the recent Machine Law, which was Wagner and I think John McCrae drawing most of it, which was about, like you said, taking something that's using the framework of 45 years ago and using it to discuss the issues of today, of mechanization and robotization of industries. And they introduce those new robot judges, and the first thing, people are appalled because, oh, they're taking our jobs. Like, we in a city that's already like terminally unemployed. But even worse, and that's the funny gag, the main problem with those robot judges is they're too nice. Like, one of them refuses to execute a citizen because he's saying, well, we can solve this with social reform a bit, like give him some money and he'll be better. And Judge Dredd is like, what are you doing? Shoot him. And the robot is like, obviously not. That's illogical. What you're ordering me to do is against the logic of my programming. And seeing that is like, oh, they can still do something interesting with that. You have any point of view on that?
I think it's a really clever way of going about it, especially when there's stories like Guatemala as well, with all of the robot dictators and stuff, where it's the exact opposite problem, where it basically it highlights the fact that in so many ways the judges are always going to be the villains, and that somehow there is always somebody that's going to be worse. But are they actually? It's a different way, and kind of coming at how do we make this a gray area from a different angle that makes it not gray at all. And I think that, especially in the contemporary ways, there's been so much done already that there's new ways to make these stories happen that can contradict itself, that still makes it work. And especially in the case of like robots that are programmed to make these decisions and make these rulings that are programmed into their body. But is that actually more powerful than the programming that can be done to people from a young age, which is exactly what's done to the judges? And I think it's another one of those like socio-political commentary pieces that maybe you don't even really think about until after you're done reading, and you go, oh, that's a lot. But that's kind of the joy of that level of subtlety and not subtlety at all. And it's the half the fun of new Judge Dredd is that you can take the subtlety that used to be in the old comics and turn it into you're turning the subtext into text, and somehow that makes it even more nuanced. You can rehash these things over again with new points, and it's just even more impressive and tilts the scales even more. And it's just great. It's really fun. I love all of the new Judge Dredd stuff that's been happening recently.
What's do you have any other preferred from the news stories? Anybody here has something that they've read recently, like last 2 years even, and it's kind of like popped into their minds of, oh, this is a story that grabbed me.
Judge Dredd the
Um,
musical.
Yeah, Zach?
Yeah, I forget the exact title, but it was one of the more absurd ones where like billionaires were building an elevator to
Space
space
elevator.
essentially. Yeah, and I don't think I've laughed harder like out loud alone in recent years than I have while reading that comic. Like it, it it just so perfectly mirrored the absurdity of actual billionaires trying to get into space. And not to spoil it for anyone, but it doesn't go well for them, and it's hijacked by the mutant monkey workers who, upon entering, yell something like, "No, the mutant monkey workers control the means of space elevator production." Like,
That's the exact line. That's one of the
yeah,
best lines. Mutant monkey worker. Oh.
yeah.
Uh,
So yeah, I love that one.
Drawn by Chris Weston, who look, I don't want to rank. I think it's unfair to rank. Art isn't a numbering competition. Chris Weston is the best ongoing Judge Dredd artist. I'm sorry, everybody else. I like a lot of your writers and artists who are doing Judge Dredd right now. I like what you do, but that guy's like next level. How do you do that type of thing, especially like on a weekly basis? You look at some of his stuff and that's impossible. You can't do that. And he does that.
It's really stunning. The name of that story, by the way, was Elevator Pitch.
Of course, yeah. And one of the impressive things about something like Elevator Pitch is that, and I think showing us the strengths of 2000 AD as a home to Judge Dredd, is you can imagine it being like an ongoing American comic story and dragging it over 3 months and 60 odd pages or 80 pages. And Elevator Pitch is like together at once, like 20 pages, 21 pages. Everything is just cut down to like as lean as you can be, and it just makes it flow a whole lot better. And Chloe, you mentioned Guatemala earlier, which one of the most interesting things to me about that story is that it touches lightly about the inherent what's the word I'm looking for? I'm sorry. Lies within the Justice Department, the lies, the hypocrisy that they allow themselves, because spoilers for that book, light spoilers, we discovered that one of the things, the reason they're going to that country and they're doing the very American, we're going to decide how we run things here in Guatemala, is that someone in that country has the children of the previous chief judge, which, of course, according to the rules of the cult of justice, judges aren't allowed to have children. They aren't allowed to have relationship. And they're like, well, but those children are important. They're the children of our former president, as it were. We're going to take them and we're going to keep them. And we're never going to admit to anybody that again and again, all those rules that we impose on other people, we're not really going to impose it on ourselves. Nobody's going to scrub that piece of legacy aside. They're just going to keep it, as it were, holy. Oh, obviously, she was a perfect judge. She did everything fine.
That's kind of like a couple of years ago. One of my favorite stories in probably the past 10 years has been the Rob Williams stuff with Small House and Trifecta and all of that great stuff. And that's also an excellent example of like the hypocrisy and the inner workings of how the Justice Department actually works, and especially that iconic page that everybody's fallen in love with Judge Smiley saying like, dude, we're fascists, like this is what's happening, like of course this is how it works, you're just too blind to see it. And it's that's something that it's definitely becoming more prevalent in these stories, is writers being more willing to put that message out there loudly. It's okay, but we need y'all to understand Judge Dredd is not a good guy. We need y'all to understand the judges are not good people. In theory, they are meant to be good, but much like much like any other toxic relationship, anything can be good, but you choose, you make the wrong choices, and it ends up becoming an absolute shit show, which is exactly what has happened with the Justice Department. And so it is interesting to see more of these stories happen where it's deeper dives and more long running dives into the problems with the background that the Justice Department is presenting. And I'm interested to see where it goes in the future, as well, as far as you can only push that message so far before it does start to the consequences of that make it fall apart. And with Dredd being this weird premonitionary series that it is, it's interesting to see how that's going to end up pushing forward in terms of what we see in real life as well, and see if it's one of those art mimics life, or is it going to be vice versa sort of thing.
It is interesting that you mentioned that, Chloe, because I'm thinking about the older stories where I feel like a lot of the classic most beloved stories are the ones where someone mentions that something's gone wrong. And usually it's not necessarily the point of the story always, but or it's not always a judge who mentions it, but somehow something, not necessarily structure, because the normal Judge Dredd, the structure is telling you that it's gone wrong, right? Shooting down innocent civilians. But I'm thinking about Origins, right? Where there's all of a sudden just, you should fix it. And then no other commentary. You just have to sit with that of oh no, we made a mistake. We've gone too far. It wasn't supposed to be like this. And I think part of it is it does, as silly as it sounds, because the whole story is about we've gone too far, it does add a certain depth, right? Because at that point, Dredd is not just part of the system that he's been raised in. It's not just everyday stuff. All of a sudden he's being told, right? And someone's kind of cracked the glass. And there's something really intriguing about that, even though it's been done a bunch of times, right? It's intriguing every time because it's well, now what? And of course, now it's just going to keep going on. But it's almost you're just waiting for the glass to break, even though it's not going to. And I'm sure that's not dissimilar to what happens in real life, right? How many times do people have the realizations, oh no, are we the baddies? And then kind of go back to their regular lives, because that's the most logical way to process information. It's the easiest way to process information and stay alive. It's the only way one knows how to act. And having those stories just break break Dredd's illusion or a judge's illusion is always compelling.
Yeah, the end of Origins, of course, is where he gets to talk to his father finally. Tell me the truth. Have I? And you've mentioned parenting relationship, and he's the metaphorically he's asking him, have I been a good child? Are you proud of me, Pa? And his dad saying him, oh, by the way, everything that you did is a terrible lie, and you should cancel it. And he has a chance, and Hershey asked him, so what did he tell you? Oh, he told me we were doing fine. He told me he was proud of me. He can't, this toughest man, the toughest lawman of the future has to lie to himself and to everyone around him because he can't handle the truth. None of these people, for all their physical bravery and toughness, can't handle any emotional weight whatsoever. The big boots thing that they keep, the joke from the early years of the strip of, well, if you're ever feeling bad in your soul, just buy tighter boots so your feet would hurt, and then you don't have to think about anything. That's I know that I heard this kind of logic myself in my life from 40 figures of, well, just find something else to focus on. Don't think about it. And since we've talking Origins, I think it's one of the stories I flipped out about most, because when I read it the first time, I was like, oh, it's fine, but I don't think I need all those holes filled. And then after a particular point in time, that story changed for me, especially the big image towards the middle of the Take the White House, were all the black helmeted judges, those early judges storming the White House and burning? Because I don't know about you, at some point in your life, you're looking at all those politicians and what they do to your world, to your country, to your planet. And I'm not from America, so I have a different view, but it's kind of like, okay, it's wrong, but I do sometimes wish someone would just come and just fix the world. I don't want to do it myself. Somebody just please come and fix the world. And that's the strip talking to your, like, mine inner fascist of like, okay, I know it's wrong to do it like this, but damn, do I want to just, punish those guys for me, punish all those evil people for me. Do you ever feel that reading Dredd of like, okay, yeah, obviously he's doing it he shouldn't do that, but if he did it to those people, I would be fine with that.
Well, it's why fascism works, right? It's a feeling that it's like ceding responsibility and someone else just deal with it. I don't want to see it. I don't want to see like how bad it gets, but like I want it to be easy and done and not have to muddle through the everyday of trying to fix this completely broken system that you feel like you have no power in. It's this idea of kind of worshiping power, worshiping the kind of power that it takes to do the kind of things that the judges do. And it's terrifying. And I do think everybody has that feeling from time to time. And that's why it works. The same way that I was talking about cults earlier, everybody wants to feel like they're loved and they're special and that they have a family. Everybody feels like they want the bad people to go away. But the answers are never simple. And when we treat them as simple, that's how we get Judge Dredd, right? That's how we get a world like that. And the thing about Judge Dredd comics, I feel like it's so interesting because it really does dig into history visually, which is what interests me the most. As like, I'm not a historian. I don't know why I make it sound like a historian, but like they take these images from fascism of the past, which doesn't necessarily look like fascism now. Like it looks different, but they take those images and they keep it modern by having those little sneaking feelings that everybody feels when they see a corrupt politician super successful, or when they see a billionaire building an elevator into space, and just this deep kind of anger that is just deep-seated for anyone who is paying attention, right? Anyone who's paying attention is angry, and you just want it to be fixed and you want to not have to think about it anymore. And that's the dangerous space. And it's so rich storytelling wise, because then we see the dialogues play out with the characters. Like, I feel like that's the interesting thing about the judges is there's always a few, right? And you'll always have a couple judges say, oh, I don't care about this. Or should we really be doing this? Like, I'd rather us do this other thing. And Dredd's always kind of pushing them back into line. And like we see these little dialogues that makes it more human and pulls out the conversations that would actually happen, or the conversations we have with ourselves, or the conversations that we have with friends that we trust, where it's just like, well, let's make an exception this time. And just, and like you see this in cop shows all the time, which is kind of the I don't know how to phrase this in a way that doesn't sound terrible, but it's often like Judge Dredd, right? Where it's, oh, we don't need a warrant break into this person's house because my gut tells me that they're guilty, right? Or we can beat the heck out of this person because we know that they're a no good, blah, 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 blah. And it's the same thing on the surface without the understanding, without like the without the self-knowledge of what it is. Like Judge Dredd knows what it's doing in a way that these cop shows do not. So the cop shows will never have if someone asks, well, shouldn't we wait for a warrant? They're like an annoying person who's slowing down justice.
Yeah.
And then in Judge Dredd, the framework tells us that, see, it goes this far when you start to do the little things. And that, I don't even know where I started, but yeah, those are my thoughts.
Because that's great, because we started with the idea of Judge Dredd being influenced by Dirty Harry, and obviously very popular. And those people at the time, they would be utterly shameless about lifting ideas. That's how we got Hook Jaws, the killer shark, not because another shark movie whatsoever, but Judge Dredd is Dirty Harry if every cop was Dirty Harry. If the guy who was doing, road stops was Dirty Harry. If the guy who took the reports was Dirty Harry, and they all were equally violent. And Dirty Harry is fun to people to imagine is like, oh, he's this guy on the streets dealing with them, the other. But you wouldn't want to be like, excuse me, officer, and then he turns, you're going to some guy in the block, excuse me, officer, somebody stole my bike, and Dirty Harry turns to you. And Judge Dredd is saying, oh, you want this? You want this cowboy? You want this guy who is the law? Here you go. As hard as you want, all of them, all the time. And that's terrifying. And that's kind of like turning the illusion on its face.
Yeah, there's almost like oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh.
There's almost like this like long time romanticization of the cop who plays by his own rules. But I think a big part of Judge Dredd is like, maybe they should play by the rules. Like maybe we should stop being like, well, what about the rebel who plays by his own rules in the police department? That's not really the place to be doing it.
For sure. And like, I feel like Clint Eastwood is actually a really good example of that. Like his movies, like they go from like kind of basic Western to Dirty Harry to like Dirty Harry on steroids, like really quickly when you look at it. And like, if you look at something like the Mule, when you look at something like Clint Eastwood's The Mule, you see it's like this fantasy of, and like his fantasy also becomes self-insert, where it's like, oh, all these young women want to have sex with me, and all the drug lords think I'm the coolest guy, even though I'm just some random old dude who carries drugs. But it's like this idea that like he represents a special type of person, and you are the special type of person who could do this too if you were also like Clint Eastwood. Like he is the ideal that somehow magically knows who to shoot and who not to. And still it's interesting because I feel like going into Clint Eastwood's filmography, Unforgiven's right on the edge, right? Of like, oh, you have something interesting to say, and it actually is something like that is kind of trying to question the kind of fake structures that Westerns built. And then immediately after that, he just keeps going into this like fascist rhetoric, like his films go into this fascist rhetoric of like it. And I guess Liam Neeson has this vibe too, where it's like, it only takes one good guy with a gun to solve all the problems. 24 is similar, right? Jack Bauer. It's just like, oh, and as long as you know that's the one good guy, it's cool that he's just shooting random people to ask them questions. Like, no big deal, because we know he's here to save us. And it's this, it takes a certain kind of, I'm gonna say Americanness, but I don't know if that's completely what I mean. This confidence that the gun would never be turned on me, to think that it's cool and fun and amazing and that he is here to save us, even though it's completely untrue. The gun will always be turned on you, because that's what happens when a rando dude who thinks he's always right is running around with a gun, right? There's always this chance, but there's this belief like in people's hearts that's like, oh, well, they're only pointing the gun at bad people, and I'm not a bad person. That allows this kind of explosion into this Clint Eastwood shoot narrative.
Yeah, it's the cowboy ethos that's in the heart of like a lot of American culture of, the town is lawless. The law doesn't exist, but this one guy rides in. Like he rides in and he fixes stuff. Why? Because he's right. And because he's right and good, like you said, his bullets will, miraculously, the bullets will only hurt those who deserve it. And Judge Dredd, again, takes it and turns it on its head of like, no, he's going to shoot. And, he decides who's innocent. If you decide who's innocent and who's guilty, obviously you can't hurt an innocent ever. And that's the power of the strip. And it's this fundamental thing that they invested in 45 years ago, this big question that allows it, I think, to keep going, while a lot of other 2000 AD strips, which I enjoy, kind of like, well, their time has come and gone. Like, you don't really need nobody really demands a Robo Hunter revival, I think. Or what was the one with the space truckers? I'm sorry, I'm blanking out.
Space trucking, man.
Yeah.
Come on now.
Sorry.
Don't even.
like it's good, but it's not
Yes,
like
you.
people are like, oh, I need another like.
I fucking do, Tom.
Okay,
I do.
okay, I okay, sorry. You know what? I'll take a Flash revival. Why not? We all need some work. See,
Ant Wars. Make it better than ever.
The
So
problem
we
with
need to be in
Dread-
charge of this.
Hmm?
In charge of like a reboot anthology and just
Yeah.
all of these things that nobody
nonsense.
remembers.
Yeah, the Balls brothers ride again.
Yes.
See, that's the problem with modern Dread. Not enough dinosaurs. If you go back to the early comics, every year or so, Pat Mills would come back and he was like, there hasn't been a dinosaur here in a while. Like, we need a dinosaur in the middle of the city. And like, I love a lot of modern Dutch Dread. I think this discussion has been proof of that. But I think we all agree we need more dinosaurs.
I think you could subtitle the panel. That's the problem with modern Judge Dredd. Not enough dinosaurs.
Yes.
The subheader for it is just bring back Tyranny Rex.
Oh, yes, certainly.
It's a theory.
So do we want to add anything? Do we have anything else to say about the law, Zach?
I just want to shout out. I think Chloe, you'd obviously would remember, but the piece that Chloe wrote, I think it was in 2020 about it was Judge Dredd, The Devil You Know. I think is like probably one of the best pieces of comics crit I've read in the last few years, and specifically about Judge Dredd. So like the last thing I want to add is if you haven't read that piece, it's I highly recommend it.
Thanks, Zach.
Sure.
Tiffany, any more words about the judge?
Justice is dangerous. It's a dangerous word. I think that's kind of the fun, is the danger, and like knowing that the ideas are dangerous. And that's why it's always going to be interesting to pick up a Judge Dredd comic and see what they're doing. I don't regularly read the new Judge Dredd stuff, but like to pick up something and like look at what the writer's trying to say and the artist is trying to say visually about our ideas of law enforcement and about what the world's problems are at the moment. That's always going to make it a fun read.
And Chloe?
I don't know. I think that as much as Dredd is framed as being an American comic, obviously because it's set in America, it is quintessentially a British comic. And even in a kind of what you were saying, Tiffany, the gun would never be pointed back at me, is I think, especially in terms of British history and colonization and all this wacky ass stuff, it is still very much a message of just how fundamentally of a British comic Dredd is, and how somehow through no fault of anybody's, that makes it a horribly universal experience. And whether that's something good or bad or relatable, it's all about how you can take a step back and read into what's happening, and realize it as both something absurd and as something entirely real. And that's the entire reason why Dredd has been just such a perfect fucking comic for 45 years. Also, only Dredd can judge me.
Amazing.
Okay, that's nice. Thanks, everybody. And reminder, listeners and viewers of this panel, if you want to read some good comic criticism, Chloe is on Neotext, Tiffany is on Panel by Panel, and Zach is on Comics Bookcase, and I'm Tom Shapira, all over the place. Thank you for listening, and have a good time.